I walked through the heavy oak doors of our home after a grueling 12-hour shift, only to find my 8-year-old son and 6-year-old daughter sobbing on the cold hardwood floor. Surrounding my children were heavy black contractor trash bags stuffed to the brim with their clothes, their toys, and their bedsheets. My parents and my golden child sister had dragged my kids out of their bedrooms because my brother-in-law decided his fake investment firm needed a home office. They told me my children and I should be grateful to sleep in the unfinished basement. They laughed in my face when I looked at them and said they just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to legally dismantle everything they had built. My name is Cassidy. I am 35 years old and I am a forensic accountant. Before I dive into exactly how I destroyed their reality, let me know what city or country you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up and protect your kids from toxic family members who were supposed to love them. Believe me, the way I handled this eviction is a masterclass in silent revenge. It was the middle of April, the absolute peak of tax season, and the Chicago wind was howling off the lake as I pulled my car into the long circular driveway of the sprawling suburban estate. The house was massive, a beautiful stone property with towering windows and a perfectly manicured lawn that my parents, William and Susan, loved to show off to the neighborhood. I had just finished a 12-hour shift digging through corporate tax fraud files. My brain was completely fried. My eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets, and my feet ached in my heels. All I wanted to do was walk inside, kiss my son Leo and my daughter Mia, read them a bedtime story, and collapse into my own bed. I turned my key in the heavy front door and pushed it open, stepping into the grand foyer with its sweeping double staircase and imported marble floors. I expected the usual evening sounds of a busy household, maybe the television playing in the den or the sound of pots and pans clinking in the kitchen. Instead, I heard something that made my blood run instantly cold. It was the sound of a child trying desperately to muffle their own crying. I dropped my leather briefcase on the marble floor. The heavy thud echoed through the silent house, but nobody came to greet me. I hurried past the formal living room and turned the corner toward the main staircase. What I saw in that moment is burned into my memory forever. My 8-year-old son Leo and my 6-year-old daughter Mia were huddled together on the bottom step. Mia had her face buried in her older brother's shoulder, her small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Leo had his arms wrapped tightly around her, trying to be brave, but tears were streaming silently down his red cheeks. But it was not just my crying children that made my stomach drop. It was what was sitting next to them. Lined up along the beautiful wooden banister were 5 massive black contractor trash bags. They were the thick, heavy-duty industrial bags you buy at the hardware store to throw away broken drywall or rotting yard clippings. One of the bags was tied so hastily that it had ripped open at the side. Spilling out onto the floor was Mia's favorite pink blanket, the one she needed to sleep with every single night. Next to it was Leo's school backpack, crushed under the weight of a haphazardly stuffed bag of winter coats and shoes. My brain could barely process the visual. My children were sitting there like refugees in their own homes, surrounded by their entire lives shoved into garbage bags. The visceral reaction of a mother seeing her children displaced and treated like literal trash is something I cannot easily put into words. A hot, blinding wave of pure adrenaline and rage flooded my chest. I felt my hands start to shake, not from fear but from a deeply primal instinct to protect my young. I rushed forward and dropped to my knees on the hard floor, gathering both of my children into my arms. They clung to me instantly. Mia buried her wet face into my neck, her small hands grabbing the collar of my blazer like she was drowning. Leo leaned his forehead against my chest and finally let out a loud, heartbroken sob now that his mother was there. I kissed the tops of their heads, rocking them gently back and forth while scanning the foyer for any sign of an intruder or an emergency. My voice trembled as I asked Leo what happened, praying that there was some logical explanation. Perhaps a pipe had burst in their bedrooms, or the ceiling had caved in. Leo looked up at me, his blue eyes bloodshot and swollen. He wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve and choked out the words. He told me that Grandma and Grandpa came upstairs into their rooms while they were doing their homework. They brought Uncle Andre and Aunt Natalie with them. Leo said Grandpa handed them the black garbage bags and told them to pack everything they owned right that second. When Leo asked why Uncle Andre told him to shut up and move faster, saying that the rooms belonged to him now, my heart pounded against my ribs like a hammer. I looked at the ripped plastic bag again. I could see the clay handprint Mia had made for me in kindergarten cracked in half because it had been tossed in so carelessly. I could see Leo's carefully organized collection of library books bent and ruined at the bottom of another bag. They had not just told my children to move. They had treated their belongings, their safe spaces, and their fragile feelings with the kind of aggressive contempt you reserve for pests. For years, I had endured the emotional coldness of this family. I grew up as the invisible daughter, the scapegoat who was never quite good enough, pretty enough, or charming enough. My younger sister Natalie was the golden child, a 32-year-old lifestyle influencer whose entire existence was funded and praised by our parents. When my marriage ended in a painful divorce, I moved back into this house to find my footing, keeping my head down, working grueling hours, and trying to be invisible so my kids could have a stable environment. I swallowed the daily insults. I ignored the snide comments about my career. I let them treat me like a burden. But this was different. You can insult me, you can belittle my job, and you can treat me like a ghost in the hallways. But the second you touch my children, the second you make them cry and throw their lives into garbage bags, you have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I needed to be calm. I am a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on patience, cold hard facts, and letting arrogant people make mistakes on paper while I quietly build an ironclad case against them. If I screamed and yelled right now, I would just be the hysterical, bitter sister they always claimed I was. I wiped the tears from Mia's cheeks and pushed Leo's hair out of his eyes. I told them in a soft, steady voice that everything was going to be okay. I promised them that nobody was going to treat them like this ever again. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles out of my suit jacket. I looked up to the top of the grand staircase. The soft glow of the chandelier illuminated the landing. I could hear the faint sound of laughter and the clinking of wine glasses coming from the hallway where my children's bedrooms used to be. They were up there celebrating. They were toasting to their new space while my children wept in the foyer. Every ounce of exhaustion from my 12-hour shift vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I did not walk up those stairs as a wounded daughter or a jealous sister. I walked up those stairs as a woman holding a loaded gun made of legal documents and property deeds. I took my first step up the carpeted stairs, leaving my crying children behind, for just a moment, ready to look my family in the eye and let them dig their own graves. I took the stairs slowly, my low heels sinking into the plush cream carpet. With every step, the sound of clinking crystal and the arrogant booming laugh of my brother-in-law grew louder. The smell of expensive, catered roasted lamb and imported truffles drifted down the hallway. It was a sickening contrast to the damp, dusty smell of the plastic garbage bags sitting just a few feet below me. When I reached the top landing, I found my path deliberately blocked. My mother, Susan, and my father, William, stood shoulder to shoulder like heavily armed guards outside an exclusive nightclub. My mother was wearing a pristine ivory cashmere sweater and pearls, holding a half-empty glass of expensive Chardonnay. She looked down her nose at me. There was no flash of guilt in her eyes. There was absolutely no maternal concern for the two terrified grandchildren crying in the foyer. Instead, her face was set in a tight, annoyed grimace, as if my very presence in my work clothes was a stain on her perfect evening. Before I could even open my mouth to demand an explanation, my mother raised her hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "Do not make a scene, Cassidy," she snapped, keeping her voice in a harsh, forced whisper so her guests in the other room would not hear. "We are not doing this tonight. Andre has very important potential clients arriving at any minute. His new investment firm is expanding rapidly, and he needs the East Wing home office to conduct his meetings. And obviously, little Jordan needs his own dedicated playroom now that he is getting older. I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her words hang in the air. Little Jordan was Natalie and Andre's 7-year-old son. He already had the largest bedroom in the house, a space that was roughly the size of my first apartment. Now, apparently, he needed an entire playroom, which meant my two children had to be unceremoniously evicted from their small shared bedrooms. "You threw my children out of their beds for a playroom," I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and perfectly steady. "You packed their entire lives into trash bags like they were yard waste." My father shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his expensive golf polo. He let out a heavy, exasperated sigh, playing his usual role of the put-upon patriarch dealing with an unruly subordinate. "Stop being so dramatic, Cassidy," my father commanded. "Nobody threw them out. We just relocated them. You and the kids can take the finished basement. There is plenty of room down there if you just clear out some of the old storage boxes. You need to understand that this family is leveling up. Andre is bringing real wealth into this household. He is a visionary. You are just a number cruncher. You sit at a desk and look at spreadsheets all day. You do not need a home office, and your kids certainly do not need premium bedrooms on the main floor." My mother took a slow sip of her wine, nodding in agreement with my father. "Your father is right," she added, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "You need to remember your place in this house, Cassidy. You only live here out of our charity. When your marriage fell apart and you came crawling back with 2 toddlers, we opened our doors to you. We put a roof over your head. You should be grateful we are letting you stay here at all. Do not bite the hand that feeds you just because your sister married a successful entrepreneur and you ended up a divorced single mother." The words hit exactly the way she intended them to. They were designed to cut me down to the bone, to remind me that in their eyes I was a massive failure. In the twisted hierarchy of my family, Natalie was the undisputed queen. She had always been the pretty one, the charismatic one, the daughter who never had to lift a single finger, but was praised for simply breathing. When Natalie married Andre, a smooth-talking man who drove leased luxury sports cars and wore flashy watches, my parents treated him like absolute royalty. They bought into his illusion of immense wealth completely. Meanwhile, I was the invisible workhorse, the reliable, boring daughter who went to college, got a practical degree, and worked 60-hour weeks to provide for my family. To them, my career as a forensic accountant was nothing more than glorified data entry. They saw my divorce as a personal embarrassment to the carefully crafted family image. They honestly believed they were doing me a favor by letting me live in this house. They actually believed they were the generous benefactors showing pity to the struggling castaway. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. The absolute staggering delusion of my parents standing in this multi-million-dollar suburban home wearing clothes they bought on maxed-out credit cards, drinking wine they could not afford, and telling me I was living on their charity. I felt a cold smile fighting to break through my expression, but I forced my face to remain entirely blank. My forensic accounting brain started mentally pulling up the ledgers, the bank statements and the foreclosure notices I had meticulously archived over the past 2 years. They did not know. They had absolutely no idea that I was the only reason they were not currently living in a cheap motel by the highway. 2 years ago, when my father secretly bankrupted his retirement fund to pay off one of Natalie's massive credit card debts, this house went into foreclosure. The bank was ready to seize everything. I stepped in anonymously, through an LLC. I bought the debt. I paid off the liens. I became the sole legal owner of the estate. I did it because despite everything, I did not want my parents to end up on the street. I let them continue to play the wealthy suburbanites, paying the astronomical property taxes and the maintenance fees myself while they treated me like a pesky tenant. And this was my reward. This was the return on my investment. My mother telling me to take my crying children and move into a damp, unheated basement so her golden child's husband could play pretend CEO in my house. I looked at my mother's smug face and then at my father's puffed up chest. Every last drop of daughterly affection I had ever harbored for these two people evaporated into thin air. The invisible chains of familial obligations snapped. They did not see me as family. They saw me as collateral damage in their pursuit of maintaining a fake image. Are you seriously telling me to move my children into a concrete basement with no heating vents while it is 40 degrees outside? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I was no longer asking as a daughter. I was asking to establish a verbal record of their intent. My mother rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed that I was still standing there instead of obediently carrying trash bags down the basement stairs. "Buy a space heater, Cassidy," she snapped, turning her back on me. "Honestly, your negativity is exhausting. Go deal with your kids and stop ruining the energy in this house. We have guests." She started walking back toward the dining room, my father trailing right behind her like an obedient shadow. They thought the conversation was over. They thought they had won just like they always did. They thought I would simply swallow my pride, comfort my children, and disappear into the dark basement so they could continue their glamorous evening. Before my parents even made it back to the dining room, heavy footsteps echoed from the second floor. Natalie and Andre appeared at the top of the stairs. My sister was wearing a champagne-colored silk slip dress, holding her phone out as if she had just finished filming a house tour for her followers. Her husband Andre walked right beside her. He was swirling a glass of expensive red wine, wearing a custom-tailored suit that I knew for a fact he bought on credit. He looked down at me with absolute disdain. Andre took a few steps down the stairs and stopped looking at the trash bags scattered across the foyer. He told me that I needed to clear this mess up before his guests arrived. He said that he and Natalie were leveling up in life. He explained that his new crypto investment firm was about to secure massive funding and the house needed to reflect their success. He said he could not have wealthy investors walking into a mansion that looked like a messy daycare center. To emphasize his point, Andre swung his polished leather shoe and kicked one of Leo's plastic toy boxes. The box skidded across the marble floor and slammed into the wall, spilling colorful building blocks everywhere. Leo buried his face deeper into my shoulder, trembling from the sudden noise. My sister Natalie just giggled and leaned against the banister. She told me that I should look at this as a fresh start. She said the basement was actually very cozy once you got used to the concrete floors, and that I should be happy to finally have my own space away from the main family areas. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw a fit or beg them to reconsider. I simply tightened my arms around my children. I stood up slowly, making sure Leo and Mia were safely tucked behind my legs. I looked dead into Andres' eyes, then shifted my gaze to Natalie, and finally back to my parents, who had stopped at the edge of the dining room to watch the spectacle. I kept my voice perfectly even and said, "You just made a huge mistake." Andre threw his head back and laughed. The sound echoed off the high ceilings. He took another sip of his wine and looked at me like I was a pathetic joke. He told me to know my place. He said I was a guest in his home, living off his family generosity, and that I should be thanking him for not throwing my kids out onto the street entirely. He turned around, placed his hand on the small of Natalie's back, and guided her toward the dining room, dismissing me completely. I did not say another word. I bent down and picked up Mia, letting her rest her tired head on my shoulder. I grabbed Leo's hand. I completely ignored the black contractor trash bags sitting on the floor. I walked right out the heavy front doors, leaving my family to their delusional dinner party. I strapped the kids into my car and drove straight toward downtown Chicago. The city lights blurred past the windows as I headed to the Four Seasons Hotel. I booked a luxury suite without blinking. If my family wanted to treat me like a penniless burden, I was going to make sure my children went to sleep surrounded by absolute comfort. We ordered room service. I let them eat warm chocolate chip cookies in a massive king-size bed while we watched cartoons. I smoothed their hair and kissed their foreheads until their breathing slowed, and they finally fell asleep, safe and warm. Once the room was completely quiet, I walked over to the desk by the window. I opened my laptop and connected to my secure virtual private network. I pulled up my encrypted banking portal and typed in my credentials. The screen illuminated the dark room, casting a blue glow over my face. I felt a genuine cold smile spread across my lips as the dashboard loaded. Andre had told me to know my place in his home. My parents had told me I was living on their charity. But numbers never lie and paper trails never forget. I clicked on a specific folder labeled Residential Assets. Inside that folder were the original notarized property deeds to the sprawling suburban estate they were currently partying in. My parents did not own that house. They had not owned it for 2 entire years. 3 years ago, my father secretly drained his retirement accounts and took out massive secret loans against the house to fund Natalie's failed organic skincare line. When the business predictably collapsed, my parents defaulted on the mortgage. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. They were weeks away from being physically removed from the property by the county sheriff. They kept it a massive secret from their country club friends, from Natalie, and especially from Andre. But they could not hide it from me. As a forensic accountant, I spotted the financial irregularities in the mail and the panicked phone calls. Instead of confronting them and shaming them, I did something incredibly foolish. I felt sorry for them. I knew that losing their social status would completely destroy them. I used the money I had acquired from my divorce settlement and my own lucrative career to quietly form an anonymous limited liability company. Through that company, I bought their foreclosed mortgage directly from the bank. I paid off the liens in full. I transferred the title into my company name. I became the sole legal owner and landlord of the property. I allowed my parents to continue living there for free, under the guise that the bank had granted them a miraculous loan modification. I paid the astronomical property taxes. I paid the homeowner's insurance. I let them keep their pride and their fake wealthy image while I took the small quiet bedroom down the hall just to be close to my family. I had saved them from absolute ruin. And tonight they thanked me by throwing my children out like garbage to make room for Andre's fake business. I downloaded the property deed and saved it directly to my desktop. I also pulled up the latest tax assessment showing my LLC as the sole proprietor. Andre thought he was the man of the house. He thought he could evict me into a freezing basement. He had absolutely no idea that he was a non-paying squatter living in my property. I closed my laptop, the quiet click echoing in the hotel room. The trap was already set, and they had just walked right into it blindly. All I had to do now was go back tomorrow morning and let them lock the cage from the inside. The morning sun pierced through the curtains of the hotel room. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months. The clarity of purpose will do that to you. I ordered room service for Leo and Mia, packed their backpacks with the few supplies we had with us, and drove them to their elementary school. I hugged them a little tighter at the drop-off line, promising them that tonight we would be staying somewhere much better. Once I watched them walk safely through the glass doors of the school, my smile faded. The warmth of the mother disappeared, replaced entirely by the cold precision of the forensic accountant. It was time to go back to the estate. I needed to gather my work files, the kids' remaining school uniforms, and our toiletries. But more importantly, I needed to see exactly how far my family was willing to take their delusion. I drove back to the sprawling suburban house. The driveway was cluttered with caterers' vans, loading up empty tables and folding chairs from the party the night before. I parked my modest sedan near the garage, took a deep breath, and walked through the front door. The foyer was a disaster. The heavy black contractor trash bags containing my children's lives were exactly where we had left them, untouched, sitting like ugly monuments against the imported marble. Nobody had bothered to move them. They just stepped around my kids' belongings like they were roadkill. I stepped past the bags and made my way down the long hallway toward the kitchen. I needed to grab the kids' custom lunch boxes and some of my secure hard drives from the basement. As I approached the massive gourmet kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed artisanal espresso filled the air. I turned the corner and stopped. Sitting at the 10-foot-long marble island were my father William and my brother-in-law Andre. They looked like they had just stepped out of a catalog for wealthy country club elites. My father was wearing a crisp linen button-down shirt, reading the financial section of the newspaper. Andre was dressed in designer golf attire, aggressively tapping on his brand-new tablet. The remnants of their lavish breakfast, half-eaten croissants, and fresh fruit were scattered across the counter. When they heard my low heels click against the hardwood floor, they both stopped what they were doing and slowly looked up. The temperature in the room plummeted. There was no greeting. There was no asking where my children slept last night. There was only the heavy, suffocating tension of two men who fully believed they held absolute authority over me. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," my father said slowly, folding his newspaper and placing it on the counter. He took off his reading glasses and glared at me. "I hope you are proud of yourself, Cassidy. Running out of here last night like a petulant teenager in front of our guests. You caused an absolute scene. Your mother was incredibly embarrassed." "I caused a scene," I replied, keeping my voice remarkably flat as I walked over to the cabinets to retrieve the lunchboxes. "You and your wife packed your grandchildren's entire existence into garbage bags and kicked them out of their rooms. But please tell me more about how my exit ruined your dinner party." Andre let out a loud, mocking scoff. He stood up from his leather bar stool, puffing out his chest, and walked around the kitchen island to physically place himself between me and the doorway. My father stood up as well, shifting to my left. Within seconds, they had strategically boxed me into the corner of the kitchen between the massive stainless steel refrigerator and the marble counter. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple. Two large men trying to physically loom over a woman to force her into submission. "Watch your tone when you speak to your father," Andre warned, his voice dropping an octave to sound more threatening. "You do not get to walk in here acting like you own the place. You are a guest in this house, Cassidy. And frankly, your attitude is becoming a massive liability to my peace of mind." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms defensively, though internally my heart rate barely spiked. I was studying them. I was watching two squatters try to exert dominance in a house I paid the property taxes on. "Your peace of mind?" I asked, raising a single eyebrow. "What about the peace of mind of my 8-year-old son, who had to sleep in a hotel because you wanted to play business executive in his bedroom?" Andre slammed his hand flat against the marble countertop. The loud smack echoed through the kitchen, rattling the expensive espresso cups. He leaned in closer, invading my personal space, his expensive cologne mixing unpleasantly with the smell of coffee. "Let us get one thing straight right now," Andre said, his eyes narrowed with pure arrogance. "This is not your house. This is the family estate. And since your father has officially handed the management of this property over to me, to leverage for my investment firm, I am the one calling the shots. I am the man of this house now. You are just a divorced squatter living off your parents' generosity. I tolerated you being upstairs because Natalie felt sorry for you. But that charity has officially expired." My father nodded in enthusiastic agreement, looking at Andre with a sickening amount of pride. It was nauseating to watch my own flesh and blood idolize a con artist while treating his own daughter like dirt. "Andre is right, Cassidy," my father chimed in, crossing his arms and looking down at me. "We are tired of your constant negativity. Natalie is building a brand. Andre is building an empire. You are just taking up space. You do not contribute to the prestige of this family. You just drain our resources. You should be down on your knees thanking us that we are even allowing you to move into the basement instead of throwing you out on the street." I looked back and forth between the two of them. They were so deeply entrenched in their own lies that they actually believed the garbage coming out of their mouths. My father was desperately clinging to the illusion of wealth, pretending he still had the power to hand over a multi-million-dollar estate to his golden son-in-law. He knew he was broke. He knew the bank had foreclosed on him 2 years ago. Yet here he was, enabling Andres' massive ego playing a dangerous game of pretend just to keep up appearances. And Andre. Andre was the epitome of unearned confidence. He was attempting to build a fraudulent investment firm using my father's non-existent assets as collateral, completely unaware that the real owner of the property was currently standing 3 feet away from him, memorizing every single word he said. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining absolute eye contact with Andre. I did not shrink back. I did not cower. I stood to my full height. So I said calmly, making sure my words were perfectly clear, "Just so we are on the same page, you are taking over my children's bedrooms to use as a home office for your investment firm, and you expect me to just quietly move my entire life into an unfinished basement." Andre smirked, clearly mistaking my calm clarification for surrender. He thought he had broken me. He thought his little display of masculine intimidation had worked. He adjusted the cuffs of his designer shirt and took a step back, giving me a tiny sliver of breathing room. "Exactly," Andre said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "See, was that so hard to understand? You stay out of our way, you keep the kids quiet, and you stay in the basement. As long as you follow the rules, we will not have a problem." My father smiled, looking thoroughly relieved that the confrontation was seemingly over. He picked up his newspaper again. "Good," my father said dismissively. "Now that we have that settled, you can start carrying those bags down the stairs. And try not to scratch the hardwood while you do it." I did not move toward the foyer. I did not look at the bags. I stayed exactly where I was, my eyes fixed on Andre. The cornering had failed to intimidate me. Instead, it had given me the perfect opening to let them spring the trap. They wanted to play landlord. They wanted to pretend they had legal authority over my life and my property. I was going to let them put that authority in writing. I tilted my head slightly and looked at Andre with a blank expression. "If I am going to live in the basement," I said softly, my voice devoid of any emotion, "I assume there are terms. You said you are managing the property now. If you want me out of the way, how exactly are we structuring this arrangement?" Andre and my father exchanged a quick, knowing glance. It was the look of two predators who thought they had just cornered their prey, entirely unaware that the prey had just handed them a loaded bomb. Andre reaches into the sleek leather messenger bag resting on the counter. He does not break eye contact with me as he unzips the main compartment and pulls out a crisp manila folder. He opens it with a dramatic flick of his wrist, extracts a single sheet of heavy stock printer paper, and slides it across the smooth marble island. The paper glides silently and stops exactly an inch from my fingertips. I look down at the document. At the very top, printed in bold, aggressive lettering, is the name of his company: Zenith Apex Holdings, LLC. Right beneath that, in perfectly centered text, it reads, "Residential Lease Agreement." I do not touch it right away. I let my eyes scan the text. As a forensic accountant, I spend 40 to 60 hours a week hunting down discrepancies in corporate ledgers, tracking phantom assets, and untangling complex webs of financial deceit. My brain is hardwired to spot legal anomalies instantly. What I read on this single sheet of paper is so staggeringly audacious, so incredibly flawed, that I actually have to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. According to this document, Zenith Apex Holdings LLC is claiming to be the official property management entity for the estate. The contract stipulates that I am to pay $3,000 a month for the exclusive use of the lower-level storage facility. That is his polite, legally vague way of describing the unheated, unfinished concrete basement. But the absolute sheer audacity does not stop there. I continue reading the fine print further down the page. The monthly payments are not to be made to the LLC or to a corporate holding account. The contract specifically demands that the $3,000 be direct deposited into Natalie's personal checking account on the first of every month. And right below that is a retroactive clause. Andre is demanding back rent. He has written into the contract that I owe rent for January, February, and March totaling $9,000, which is due immediately upon signing today. I slowly lift my head and look at Andre. He is watching me closely, a deeply self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He picks up his expensive gold-plated pen and taps it rhythmically against the marble, waiting for my reaction. He expects me to burst into tears. He expects me to break down and beg for mercy. $3,000 a month, I say, making sure my voice sounds perfectly level, stripped of any emotion, for an unfinished basement with exposed plumbing and bare concrete floors, and you want it backdated to the first of the year. Andre leans forward, resting his muscular forearms on the island to physically crowd my space again. That is the family discount, Cassidy. Market rate for renting a private suite in a luxury estate of this caliber would be double that easily. You have been freeloading off your parents for months now. Natalie and I discussed it extensively last night, and we feel it is only fair that you start contributing to the household now that I am taking over the financial management of the property. We are running a business here, not a charity. I shift my gaze over to my father. William is standing taller now, his chest puffed out, clearly emboldened by Andre's aggressive posturing. You are letting him charge me back rent to live underground in a house you invited me into. I ask my father directly, giving him one last chance to realize the absolute absurdity of what he is allowing to happen. My father does not flinch. He does not show a single ounce of shame. He crosses his arms over his chest and delivers his justification with a straight face. Andre is the man of the house now, Cassidy. I have officially handed over the estate's management to him and his firm. He is using this property to back his investment portfolio, which means every square foot of this house is now a corporate asset. You cannot just live here for free anymore. You are a grown woman with a decent job. It is time you paid your fair share and respected the new hierarchy of this family. I look back down at the piece of paper resting in front of me. The legal implications of this single document are catastrophic for them. Andre is using a registered limited liability company to draft a fraudulent lease agreement for a multi-million-dollar property he does not own. He is doing this in a state where his company is not legally registered to operate, and he is demanding extortionate rent to be paid directly into his wife's personal bank account to dodge corporate taxes. It is wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate malfeasance, all wrapped up into one incredibly convenient signed confession. But I cannot let them know that I know. I need to play the cornered victim just a little bit longer. I need them to feel absolute power so they will push all their chips into the center of the table. I cannot afford a $9,000 lump sum payment right now, I say, intentionally injecting a slight pathetic tremble into my voice. I drop my shoulders, making myself look defeated. And the basement does not even have proper heating vents. It drops to 40 degrees down there at night. Leo and Mia will freeze. I cannot sign this, Andre. It is completely unreasonable. The moment I show vulnerability, my father strikes. The polite mask of the wealthy suburban gentleman falls away, completely revealing the toxic, controlling manipulator he truly is under the surface. You will sign it right now, my father says, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He takes a step toward me, pointing a rigid finger directly at my face. You will sign that lease, and you will set up the direct deposit to your sister today, because if you refuse and you insist on squatting down there without paying, I will make a phone call. I look up at him, keeping my expression fearful and wide-eyed. A phone call to who? I ask, my voice barely above a whisper. My father leans in so close I can see the broken blood vessels on his nose. I will call Child Protective Services. I will personally tell them that my unstable divorced daughter is forcing my innocent grandchildren to sleep on a damp concrete floor in a freezing basement with exposed wiring and dangerous conditions. I will tell the state authorities that you are neglecting them. They will be at this house before dinner, Cassidy. They will take Leo and Mia away from you, and I will make sure the court gives emergency custody to Natalie and Andre, since they are the responsible adults providing a safe, luxurious home. The silence in the kitchen is absolute. Even Andre looks momentarily stunned by the sheer, unadulterated viciousness of my father's threat. But Andre quickly recovers, his smirk returning as he realizes he has the ultimate leverage. My father is weaponizing my children. He is threatening to have the state rip my son and daughter out of my arms simply to force me to pay his golden son-in-law extortion money. It is the ultimate betrayal. Any lingering trace of familial guilt I might have had about what I was about to do to them vanishes entirely into the cold Chicago air. The slate is wiped totally clean. These people are no longer my family. They are parasites, and they have just threatened the only things in this world that actually matter to me. I look down at the fraudulent lease agreement in my hands. I feel the heavy texture of the paper between my fingers. This piece of paper is not a lease. It is Andres' death warrant. It is the physical, tangible evidence that will put him in a federal penitentiary and ruin my parents' fake social standing forever. My heart beats in a steady, perfectly calm rhythm. I do not scream. I do not cry. I do not beg my father to reconsider his monstrous threat to call the authorities on me. As a forensic accountant, I know a fundamental truth about human nature. The most dangerous people in the room are never the ones screaming and throwing tantrums. The most dangerous people are the ones who quietly collect the receipts. I slowly reach out across the marble island. I pick up the expensive gold pen Andre left resting next to his espresso cup. I uncap it, look my father dead in the eye, and prepare to sign my name to the trap they just built for themselves. I held the heavy gold pen suspended over the thick paper. Before the ink touched the page, my eyes darted over the paragraphs one final time. I needed to memorize every single detail of his fatal mistake. The document listed Zenith Apex Holdings, LLC, as a Nevada-based corporate entity. But right there, boldly printed under the company letterhead, was the address of this Chicago estate listed as the primary corporate headquarters. Andre was officially claiming a property he did not own as the central asset of his out-of-state investment fund. Then I looked at the payment instructions. He had listed a routing number for a bank branch located in New York attached to Natalie's personal checking account. He was demanding that I electronically transfer $3,000 across state lines for a fraudulent lease. In my line of work, we call that a textbook violation of Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343, wire fraud. By creating this document demanding electronic payment and tying it to a fake corporate headquarters, Andre had just escalated a petty family squabble into a federal felony. And by backdating the rent to January 1st, he was generating phantom income that I knew for an absolute fact he would never report to the IRS tax evasion. It was a beautiful, devastating trifecta of corporate malfeasance. I forced my hand to tremble slightly. I needed them to believe that my father's threat to call Child Protective Services had completely broken my spirit. The threat to weaponize the state against my children was a line that once crossed destroyed any moral obligation I had left toward the man who raised me. He was no longer my father. He was a hostile entity threatening my family, and I was going to neutralize him. I let out a jagged, defeated sigh and allowed a single tear to well up in the corner of my eye. I looked at my father, letting him see the manufactured fear on my face. "You win," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly fragile. "I will pay the money. Just please do not call the state on me. Do not take my kids away." My father let out a dismissive scoff, adjusting the collar of his linen shirt. He stood there, perfectly content to watch his own daughter get extorted. He had traded his role as a protector for the illusion of status. He was so desperate to be associated with Andre's fake wealth that he was willing to throw his own grandchildren into a freezing basement. He looked down at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He told me that it never had to come to this if I had just learned to respect authority in the first place. He said that this was a harsh but necessary lesson in how the real world works. I lowered the pen to the paper. The gold nib scratched against the heavy stock as I signed my full legal name on the tenant line. I dated it exactly as he requested. I made sure my signature was clear, legible, and legally binding. I was not just signing a fake lease. I was authenticating the very evidence the federal government would use to freeze every single bank account Andre and Natalie possessed. I placed the cap back on the pen and set it down on the marble island. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the paper and slowly slid it back across the counter toward Andre. He snatched it up immediately, his eyes scanning my signature to make sure I had not written anything defiant. When he saw that I had complied perfectly, a massive, arrogant smirk spread across his face. I kept my eyes locked on his and lowered my voice. "I hope you kept a copy for your records, Andre." Andre let out a loud, victorious laugh. He folded the lease neatly and tucked it into the inner pocket of his designer suit jacket. He patted his chest and told me not to worry about his records. He said his firm kept meticulous track of all its passive income streams. He then pointed toward the hallway and told me I had exactly 2 hours to move the garbage bags full of my kids' belongings down to the basement before his caterers returned to clean up the rest of the dining room. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I did not look back. I made my way to the foyer where the 5 heavy black trash bags were still sitting on the marble floor. I grabbed the first 2 bags, my hands gripping the cheap plastic, and began dragging them toward the basement door. I opened the door and flipped the light switch. The single bare bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows over the unfinished wooden stairs. I carried the bags down one by one. The air down here was cold and damp. The floor was solid concrete and the walls were exposed insulation and cinder blocks. It was a bleak, depressing space that no child should ever have to sleep in. But as I set the last bag down on the cold floor, I did not feel defeated. I felt invincible. I walked over to a dusty folding table tucked in the corner of the room. I dragged it to the center of the basement directly under the single light bulb. I went upstairs, grabbed 2 folding chairs from the garage and brought them down. Then I brought down my heavy work briefcase. I unlatched the leather straps and pulled out my encrypted work laptop, my portable hard drives, and my stack of blank legal pads. I wiped the dust off the folding table and set up my equipment. This cold, unfinished basement was no longer my prison. It was my war room. I plugged my laptop into the single available wall outlet and booted it up. My screen illuminated the dark, damp room. I had the LLC name, Zenith Apex Holdings. I had the Nevada registration claim, and I had the New York routing number from the lease. That was more than enough for a forensic accountant with federal database access to tear his entire operation apart. I logged into the secured financial network. I typed his company name into the search bar and hit enter. Within minutes, the house of cards began to reveal itself on my screen. Andre was not a brilliant crypto investor. He was a middleman running a highly illegal Ponzi scheme. He was soliciting funds from wealthy, unsuspecting locals, promising them massive returns based on his supposed real estate portfolio. But there was no portfolio. The only property he was claiming as collateral was the house I owned. He was taking the investors' money, using a portion of it to pay off early adopters, to create the illusion of profit, and funneling the rest directly into Natalie's checking account to fund her lavish lifestyle influencer aesthetic. By forcing me to sign that lease, he had officially connected his fraudulent corporate entity to a physical property. He had provided the missing link. He had handed me the exact piece of documentation the Securities and Exchange Commission would need to launch a full-scale investigation. They thought they had buried me in the basement to suffer in silence. They did not realize they had just given me uninterrupted quiet time to systematically dismantle their entire lives. I opened a new encrypted file, titled it Zenith Apex Audit, and began to type. 2 weeks passed in a blur of concrete dust and federal tax codes. Down in the unfinished basement, I created a cozy and safe bubble for Leo and Mia. I bought thick woolen rugs to cover the freezing floor, set up heavy-duty space heaters, and projected their favorite animated movies onto the bare cinder block walls. To my children, it was an extended indoor camping adventure. They roasted marshmallows over a tiny electric stove and built forts out of the moving boxes. But to me, that basement was a war room. Every single night after they went to sleep, I sat at my dusty folding table and pulled up the encrypted Zenith Apex audit file. I tracked every fraudulent wire transfer Andre made. I cataloged the fake corporate addresses, the phantom property listings, and the illegal flow of funds directly into Natalie's personal checking account. I built an impenetrable digital fortress of federal evidence, all while my family upstairs remained blissfully ignorant, completely consumed by their own vanity. The climax of their delusion arrived on a crisp Friday evening. Andre and Natalie were hosting what they called an exclusive investor gala right in my main dining room. The entire goal of the night was to secure $500,000 in seed money from a group of wealthy, unsuspecting local businessmen. I could hear the absolute chaos of their preparations through the floorboards all afternoon. There were heavy footsteps, rushing back and forth, the clinking of expensive rented crystal, and the sound of my mother barking harsh orders at a team of private caterers. They had even hired professional valet parking attendants to stand at the end of my driveway, ready to park the luxury cars of the men Andre was actively planning to defraud. About an hour before the first wealthy guests were scheduled to arrive, the main power circuit for my basement space heaters suddenly tripped. The sudden darkness frightened Mia, so I promised her I would fix it immediately. I needed to go upstairs to the main breaker box, which was located in the second-floor hallway right next to the bedrooms. I grabbed a flashlight, told the kids to stay bundled under their blankets, and quietly walked up the wooden basement stairs. When I opened the door to the main floor, the heavy smell of roasted duck, expensive truffle oil, and massive floral arrangements hit me instantly. The house had been completely transformed into a theatrical stage set designed to project generational wealth. I made my way down the hallway, stepping carefully to avoid the rushing catering staff who were carrying trays of silver cutlery. As I walked past what used to be Leo's and Mia's bedrooms, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy wooden doors were propped wide open. I stood there staring, feeling a sickening knot form in my stomach. All traces of my children had been surgically erased from the spaces they had grown up in. Leo's colorful superhero posters, his glowing solar system mobile, and Mia's beautiful pink butterfly curtains were completely gone. In their place, Natalie had clearly hired a high-end interior designer to install pure white modern furniture, massive arched gold mirrors, and ridiculous beige pampas grass arrangements. She had turned my children's warm, safe spaces into sterile, lifeless lifestyle backdrops for her social media accounts. There was no desk for a home office like Andre had claimed. There was no playroom for little Jordan. It was nothing but a vain, empty set for my sister to take pictures of herself. Natalie was standing right in the middle of Mia's former bedroom, holding her phone attached to a bright, blinding ring light. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk evening gown, her blonde hair perfectly styled in loose waves. She was spinning slowly for her camera, performing for her audience. I stood silently in the doorway and listened as she spoke to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She stared into the lens and talked about how absolutely exhausted she was from renovating her massive new estate. She gushed about how incredibly blessed she was to be married to a successful financial visionary like Andre. She told her followers that they were hosting a massive gala tonight to expand their corporate empire, and she wanted to remind all her fans that if they just manifested hard enough, they could have this perfect luxury life too. She was selling a complete and total fantasy, using the stolen bedrooms of her own niece and nephew to farm validation and sponsorship deals from strangers on the internet. She stopped her slow spin when she suddenly noticed my reflection in her ring light mirror. She immediately tapped her phone screen to end her live stream and dropped her fake, bubbly influencer smile. Her face instantly twisted into a harsh scowl as she turned around and looked me up and down. I was wearing my comfortable gray sweatpants and an oversized college sweatshirt, a stark contrast to her glamorous designer gown. She marched over to the doorway, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She crossed her arms over her chest and demanded to know what I was doing out of the basement. She reminded me that incredibly important guests were arriving in 45 minutes, and she said she could not have me wandering the halls looking like a homeless person while Andre was trying to secure $500,000. I looked past her at the hideous beige ceramic vase, sitting exactly where my daughter's toy chest used to be. A familiar wave of hot anger washed over me, but I forced it down deep into my chest. I was holding a royal flush, and I just needed to let my sister keep betting her entire life savings on a pair of twos. I kept my voice perfectly calm and flat. I told her the breaker had tripped, and I just needed to flip the switch so my children would not freeze in the dark. Natalie rolled her eyes dramatically and stepped aside. She complained that my cheap space heaters were probably going to overload the grid and burn her beautiful house down to the ground. She actually called it her house right to my face. The absolute delusion was almost physically painful to endure, but I simply nodded, walked past her, and flipped the heavy metal switch inside the breaker box. I turned back toward the stairs, fully intending to return to the basement and let them play their dangerous game of pretend. But before I could take 3 steps down the hall, I heard the sharp, commanding click of my mother's shoes walking rapidly toward us. My mother rounded the corner holding a silver clipboard and looking incredibly stressed. When she saw me standing there in my sweatpants, her eyes lit up. It was not a look of maternal affection. It was the sudden calculating realization that she had just found another servant to exploit for her perfect evening. I did not know it yet, but my mother was about to make a demand so insulting that it would force me to completely change my plans and bring their entire house of cards crashing down tonight. My mother stopped abruptly in the hallway, the silver clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She looked frantic, her perfectly styled hair slightly out of place. When her eyes locked onto me standing there in my college sweatshirt and gray sweatpants, the anxiety on her face immediately morphed into sharp, calculating relief. She did not ask how my children were doing down in the cold basement. She did not ask if the power outage had scared them. Instead, she marched over to a rolling cart the caterers had left near the staircase, grabbed a folded piece of black fabric and shoved it aggressively into my chest. I instinctively caught the fabric before it fell to the floor. I unfolded it slowly. It was a heavy black catering apron, the exact same kind the hired waitstaff were currently wearing in the kitchen. I looked up at her, my face completely blank, waiting for her to explain why she was handing me a uniform in my own house. "Do not just stand there staring at me," my mother hissed, her voice a harsh, panicked whisper. One of the servers for the catering company called out sick at the last minute. "We are completely understaffed, and the first wave of investors is going to be arriving in less than 30 minutes. Go put on some black slacks and a crisp white button-down shirt. Tie that apron around your waist and get into the kitchen." I looked down at the black apron in my hands, then back up at the woman who gave birth to me. "You want me to serve hors d'oeuvres at Andre's fake business party?" I asked, making sure to keep my tone perfectly level despite the raging fire building in my chest. My mother let out an exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes. "Stop calling it fake, Cassidy. Andre is on the verge of securing $500,000 tonight. This is the most important night of his career, and everything needs to be flawless. We cannot have empty champagne flutes or cold appetizers circulating the room. So yes, I need you to put on the apron and pass the trays. At least make yourself useful since you have not paid Andre your basement rent yet." The audacity of her statement hung heavy in the air. She was actually trying to leverage a fraudulent lease agreement for a property she lost to foreclosure to force her own daughter into unpaid servitude. The mental gymnastics required to justify her behavior were truly staggering. She expected me to shrink down to obey her commands just to maintain the fragile illusion of our perfect family image in front of a room full of wealthy strangers. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. My mother continued, taking a step closer and lowering her voice to a vicious, threatening tone. "When you are out there on the floor, you are serving. You are not mingling. Do not speak to the guests unless they ask you a direct question about the food. If anyone asks who you are hired help from the catering agency. You do not mention that you are my daughter. You do not mention that you live in the basement. I will not have you embarrassing Natalie and Andre by reminding everyone that you are a divorced, struggling single mother while they are trying to project an image of absolute success. Do you understand me? She wanted to erase me completely. It was not enough that she had evicted my children from their bedrooms so Natalie could have a pristine background for her social media posts. Now my mother wanted to parade me around the dining room as a nameless, faceless servant to elevate her golden son-in-law. She wanted me to hand over plates of expensive food to the very men Andre was plotting to defraud, all while pretending I did not belong to this family. A normal person might have thrown the apron in her face. A normal person might have started screaming, demanding respect, or threatening to expose the foreclosure right then and there. But I am not a normal person. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my life examining the arrogant mistakes of greedy people. When someone hands you the perfect opportunity to infiltrate the room where the crime is happening, you do not throw a tantrum. You accept the invitation. I looked at my mother. I saw the desperate need for control in her eyes. I saw the pathetic lengths she was willing to go to in order to protect an illusion that was already dead on paper. The federal government already had the prospectus. The authorities were already looking into Zenith Apex Holdings based on the files I had submitted anonymously days ago. Tonight was not going to be the start of Andre's empire. Tonight was going to be the grand finale of his criminal career, and I suddenly realized that I absolutely needed a front row seat to the show. I tightened my grip on the black apron. I looked at her with a completely submissive, defeated expression. I let my shoulders drop and let out a soft, compliant sigh. "You are right," I said quietly. "I have not paid the rent yet. I should do my part to help the family tonight. I will go downstairs and get ready." My mother let out a loud breath of relief, the tension leaving her shoulders instantly. "Finally, you are acting like a team player," she said, offering me a fake, tight-lipped smile. "Hurry up. The valet is already parking the first car. I need you in the kitchen, plating the crab cakes in 10 minutes. She turned on her heel and rushed back toward the dining room, completely satisfied that she had successfully bullied her disappointing daughter into submission. She thought she had won. She thought I was going to slink back down to the freezing concrete basement, put on a cheap white shirt, and spend the entire evening invisible and obedient. I walked back to the basement door and opened it. I walked down the wooden stairs, the heavy black apron dangling from my hand. When I reached the bottom, I walked past the folding table that served as my desk. I walked past the thick rugs and the space heaters keeping my children warm while they watched their movie. I walked directly over to the large plastic trash can in the corner of the room and dropped the catering apron inside. I did not need a uniform to serve Andre his karma tonight. I needed armor. I walked over to the heavy canvas garment bag hanging from a makeshift rack in the corner. I unzipped it slowly. Inside was the most expensive piece of clothing I owned. It was a custom-tailored charcoal gray designer suit I had purchased to wear during high-stakes federal court testimonies. It was cut beautifully, projecting absolute authority, wealth, and razor-sharp professionalism. I slipped out of my sweatpants and college hoodie. I put on the crisp silk blouse and slid my arms into the perfectly fitted blazer. I stepped into a pair of black designer stilettos that echoed sharply against the concrete floor. I pulled my hair out of its messy bun, brushing it until it fell smoothly over my shoulders, and applied a bold, dark red lipstick. I looked at myself in the small mirror leaning against the cinder block wall. The tired, invisible sister was gone. The compliant, beaten-down daughter was dead. Standing in the mirror was the sole legal owner of the multi-million-dollar estate upstairs. Standing in the mirror was the forensic accountant who held the keys to Andre's federal indictment. My mother wanted me to come to the party. She wanted me to walk into that dining room while Andre pitched his fraudulent investment firm to a room full of millionaires. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. I was going to attend the gala. But I was not going to be passing out appetizers. I was going to serve them a reality check, so devastating they would never recover. I walked up the wooden basement stairs with a completely different energy than when I had descended them earlier. My black designer stilettos clicked sharply against the wood. a rhythmic, powerful sound that completely drowned out the background noise of the catering crew bustling on the main floor. I pushed open the basement door and stepped into the main hallway. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume roasted duck and the low, murmuring hum of wealthy men discussing money. Before I even reached the arched entryway of the dining room, my mother intercepted me. She was rushing out of the kitchen holding a silver tray of champagne flutes, her face flushed from playing the perfect high society hostess. When she turned and saw me, the color completely drained from her face. She stopped dead in her tracks, the crystal glasses rattling violently against the silver tray. Her eyes darted wildly over my appearance. She took in the custom charcoal gray designer blazer, the silk blouse, and the dark red lipstick perfectly applied to my mouth. She looked at my empty hands, realizing the black catering apron was nowhere to be seen. For a split second, pure rage flashed across her features. She opened her mouth to speak, a furious, venomous whisper forming on her lips. She wanted to order me back downstairs. She wanted to demand that I strip off my expensive clothes and put on the uniform of a servant, but I did not even break my stride. I looked right through her, as if she were an invisible piece of the horrible beige furniture Natalie had brought into the house. I did not slow down. I did not blink. I glided past her, leaving her standing there utterly paralyzed, trapped by the presence of a wealthy couple walking right behind me. She could not scream. She could not cause a scene. She simply had to swallow her rage and watch me walk right into the center of her golden sun's delicate illusion. I stepped into the grand dining room. The space was bathed in warm golden light from the massive crystal chandelier overhead. There were about 20 people in the room holding crystal glasses and laughing at whatever joke Andre had just told. Andre was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a flashy blue suit that screamed new money. He was waving his hands expressively, pitching his absolute garbage investment strategy to a group of older, distinguished-looking men who controlled real wealth in this city. Natalie was clinging to his arm, nodding along her fake influencer smile, plastered across her face as she played the role of the adoring, successful wife. They looked like the perfect power couple. Until they saw me. The heavy, authoritative click of my heels against the hardwood floor naturally drew the attention of the room. When you wear a suit tailored specifically for high-stakes federal court, you do not blend into the background. You command the space. In the corporate world, predators recognize predators. The older businessmen turned their heads, their conversations naturally pausing as I walked directly into the light of the chandelier. They did not see a struggling divorced single mother who had been evicted into a freezing basement. They saw a high-level executive. They saw a woman who looked like she held the keys to the vault. The visual shift in power was instantaneous and absolute. Beside me, the men in the room unconsciously straightened their postures. A tall, silver-haired man standing nearest to Andre turned his full attention to me. He was wearing a meticulously tailored black suit and possessed the quiet, understated confidence of someone who actually had money rather than someone just pretending to. I recognized him instantly from my research. His name was Richard, a massive commercial real estate developer in Chicago, and he was the primary target Andre was trying to bleed for $500,000 tonight. Richard looked at me with genuine curiosity and respect. He assumed I was a senior partner at Zenith Apex Holdings, the brilliant financial mind operating behind the scenes of Andre's flashy presentation. He smiled politely and extended his hand toward me. "Good evening," Richard said, his voice deep and smooth. "I do not believe we have had the pleasure of being introduced. I am Richard Vance, and you must be part of the executive team." I stepped forward confidently, reaching out and shaking his hand with a firm, practiced grip. I looked him directly in the eye, projecting absolute authority. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Richard," I replied, my voice projecting clearly over the soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers. "My name is Cassidy. I am a forensic accountant, and I am the sole legal owner of the property management structure for this very estate." I spoke with perfect clarity, offering a statement that was entirely truthful, yet incredibly terrifying to the two frauds standing at the head of the table. I did not claim to work for Andre. I did not validate his company. I simply stated my profession and my absolute dominance over the ground we were currently standing on. I could physically feel the panic radiating from Andre and Natalie across the room. Natalie tightened her grip on Andre's arm so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Her perfect influencer smile froze into a painful, tight grimace. Her eyes were darting wildly back and forth between me and Richard, absolutely terrified that I was going to ruin her pristine aesthetic and expose her carefully curated life as a massive lie. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. Andre completely lost his train of thought. He had been mid-sentence talking about aggressive portfolio expansion, but the words literally died in his throat. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, reflecting the light from the chandelier. He wanted to scream at me. He wanted to march across the room, grab me by my expensive lapels, and throw me out the front door just like he had thrown my children's toys into contractor bags. But he could not do a single thing. He was completely trapped by the social rules of the affluent world he was so desperately trying to infiltrate. You do not cause a scene in front of investors. You do not yell at a well-dressed, articulate woman in the middle of a luxury gala. If he acted aggressively toward me, he would look completely unstable and unprofessional. If he tried to kick me out, Richard and the other investors would immediately question his temperament and his business acumen. Andre and Natalie had spent weeks building this elegant, sophisticated facade to trap these investors, and now they were completely imprisoned by it themselves. They had to stand there and smile. They had to pretend that my presence was totally normal and welcomed. My mother hovered in the archway, her knuckles white as she gripped the silver tray, entirely powerless to stop the disaster unfolding in front of her. Richard nodded approvingly at my introduction, clearly impressed by my credentials. A forensic accountant, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. That is incredibly impressive. You must keep a very close eye on the numbers around here. I let a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I looked past Richard, locking eyes directly with Andre. The sheer terror in my brother-in-law's eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. You have no idea, Richard, I said softly, never breaking eye contact with Andre. I see absolutely everything, and I assure you the numbers on this property are about to become very, very interesting tonight. Andre realized he was rapidly losing control of his own event. He saw the way Richard, the wealthiest mark in the room, was looking at me with genuine professional respect. Panic flickered behind Andre's eyes, but he quickly masked it with his signature brand of unearned confidence. He stepped to the head of the long mahogany dining table and picked up a crystal knife, tapping it sharply against his champagne flute. The high-pitched ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the room, forcing all the investors, including Richard, to turn their attention back to him. Thank you all for being here tonight. Andre began projecting his voice so it echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He flashed a brilliant, perfectly practiced smile. We have gathered some of the sharpest financial minds in Chicago in this room, and I want to personally welcome you to the future of Zenith Apex Holdings. As you know, my firm specializes in aggressive portfolio expansion, identifying undervalued markets, and leveraging hard tangible assets to generate massive guaranteed returns. Andre gestured expansively around the lavish dining room. He pointed to the expensive artwork, the imported marble floors, and finally, he extended his hand toward my father, William, who was standing nearby with his chest puffed out in absolute pride. In the world of high-stakes investing, security is everything, Andre continued, his voice dripping with smooth charisma. That is why I am thrilled to announce that as of this week, my brilliant father-in-law, William, has officially signed the management and leveraging rights of this entire $2.5 million estate over to Zenith Apex Holdings. This property serves as the bedrock collateral for our Series A funding round. It is fully paid off, completely unencumbered, and it guarantees that your seed money is backed by elite prime real estate. A low murmur of approval rippled through the group of investors. A few of them nodded, clearly impressed by the idea of a debt-free mansion acting as a safety net for their $500,000 investment. My father smiled broadly, soaking in the admiration of men he desperately wanted to be peers with. He was playing the role of the wealthy patriarch perfectly. I picked up a glass of sparkling water from the table. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch for just a second before I spoke. Andre, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a surgical blade. How exactly do you leverage a property deed you do not possess into a Series A funding round without triggering a federal audit? The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Every single head in the room snapped toward me. The investors frowned, their expressions shifting instantly from polite interest to sharp, calculating suspicion. Andre froze. The charming smile melted off his face, leaving behind a look of absolute horror. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Cassidy, what are you talking about? Andre stammered, a nervous chuckle escaping his throat. He looked at the investors, trying to play it off as a joke. My sister-in-law has a very dry sense of humor, gentlemen. I did not laugh. I did not smile. I set my glass down on the table with a firm, definitive click. I am not joking, Andre, I said, taking 2 steps forward so I was standing directly under the chandelier, addressing the entire room. You just stood in front of potential investors and claimed this $2.5 million estate as unencumbered corporate collateral. But William does not own this house. He has not owned it for 2 years since it fell into severe foreclosure due to massive undisclosed personal debt. He cannot sign the leveraging rights over to your LLC because his name is not on the deed. The color completely drained from my father's face. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a serving cart. The illusion he had spent years protecting was violently ripped away in front of the exact people he was trying to impress. You are soliciting $500,000 in seed money based on a phantom asset. I continued, my voice steady, professional, and completely merciless. You are using a fraudulent lease agreement backdated to January to generate fake corporate revenue. Furthermore, your prospectus routes all passive income not into a corporate holding account, but directly into the personal checking account of your wife, Natalie. For a company supposedly based in Nevada, operating out of a fake headquarters in Chicago, and funneling unregistered securities across state lines into New York bank accounts, that is not an investment strategy. That is Title 18 United States Code Section 1343. That is federal wire fraud. The absolute destruction of his pitch took less than 60 seconds. The investors were not fools. They were ruthless businessmen who survived in their industries by immediately identifying liabilities. The moment I started citing specific federal tax codes and tracking the illegal flow of funds, they knew, with absolute certainty, that I was telling the truth. Richard stepped away from the table, his face hardening into a mask of pure disgust. He placed his untouched drink on a side table. He looked at Andre, who was now sweating profusely. Heavy beads of perspiration rolled down Andre's forehead and soaked into the collar of his expensive blue suit. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but he was hyperventilating so badly that no words came out. Is this true? Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, demanding register. Are you pitching me a fraudulent prospectus on a foreclosed property? Before Andre could even attempt to construct a lie, my mother absolutely lost her mind. The social protocols she cherished so deeply completely shattered. She realized that the fake empire her golden son-in-law was building was collapsing right in her dining room, and her first instinct was to attack the person exposing it. Get out! My mother screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. She threw the silver tray she was holding onto the floor. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the hardwood, sending shards of glass and expensive alcohol flying everywhere. The explosive noise made several of the investors jump back in shock. Get out of my house right now, Cassidy, my mother shrieked, her face turning a mottled, furious shade of purple. She pointed a shaking finger at the front door. You are a jealous, bitter liar. You are ruining everything. Get back down to the basement where you belong and get out of my house. Her screaming was the final nail in the coffin. She did not calmly refute my claims with legal documents. She threw a violent, unhinged temper tantrum. She confirmed to every single investor in that room that this was not a stable, high-end corporate environment. It was a chaotic, dysfunctional family running a desperate scam. Richard did not even wait for me to respond. He buttoned his suit jacket, shot one final look of utter contempt at Andre, and turned to the other businessmen. "Gentlemen, I think we have heard enough," Richard said firmly. "We are leaving." The mass exodus was immediate. The investors did not say goodbye. They did not shake hands. They practically trampled over each other to get to the front door, desperate to distance themselves from a man who was clearly about to be indicted by the federal government. The sound of the heavy oak door opening and closing repeatedly echoed through the foyer as $500,000 walked right out of my family's lives forever. Natalie collapsed into one of the dining chairs, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically as she realized her wealthy influencer lifestyle was officially dead. My father stood frozen in the corner, staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, his reputation in the wealthy suburban community permanently destroyed. Andre stood at the head of the empty table, his chest heaving, his expensive suit stained with sweat. He looked at me with a mixture of pure hatred and absolute terror. He finally realized that the quiet, invisible woman he had tried to banish to the basement was actually the architect of his total ruin. The party was over, and the real nightmare for them was just beginning. I woke up the next morning to the sound of heavy, aggressive footsteps pacing back and forth across the hardwood floors right above my head. Down in the basement, it was quiet and cold, but I felt entirely at peace. I watched my children, Leo and Mia, sleeping soundly under their thick blankets, completely unaware of the absolute chaos I had unleashed upstairs the night before. I knew exactly what was happening on the main floor. The panic from the ruined dinner party had clearly curdled into desperate, delusional rage. Narcissists never accept defeat gracefully. When their backs are against the wall and their lies are exposed, they do not apologize. They double down. Andre and my father had spent the entire night convincing themselves that I was just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin their lives with empty threats. They actually believed that if they could just physically remove me from the house, all of their problems would magically disappear. They thought they could silence the federal investigation I had promised simply by throwing me out onto the street. Around 9 in the morning, the heavy, pristine silence of our affluent suburban neighborhood was broken by the sound of tires crunching rapidly on the gravel driveway, followed immediately by the distinct sharp chirp of police sirens. I opened my laptop and checked the security cameras I had quietly installed around the exterior of the property 2 years ago. 2 local sheriff cruisers were parked right outside the heavy oak front doors. Their red and blue emergency lights flashed brightly, reflecting off the large bay windows and drawing the immediate gossiping attention of every wealthy neighbor on the street. This was not a quiet, discreet family dispute. This was a calculated, theatrical execution. My father and Andre wanted a massive public spectacle. They wanted the entire neighborhood to see the police dragging the disgraced divorced daughter out of the luxury estate. They were trying to reestablish their dominance and protect their fragile egos by weaponizing the law against me. They were entirely unaware that the law was exactly what I had been waiting for them to invite inside. A few minutes later, the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs was violently thrown open. The door slammed against the drywall, the sound echoing down the concrete stairwell like a gunshot. My father shouted my name, his voice booming with a forced, aggressive authority that he only ever used when he felt protected by other men. He ordered me to come upstairs immediately. He shouted down into the dark stairwell that the sheriff was here and that I was officially being evicted for trespassing and non-payment of rent. He told me to grab my crying children and whatever fit in my hands because I was leaving the premises in the back of a squad car if I did not comply that very second. I did not panic. I did not rush. I took a slow, deep breath and gently woke Leo and Mia. I kept my voice soft and cheerful, telling them we were going to go on a fun morning drive to get chocolate chip pancakes. But they needed to stay in their sleeping bags just a few minutes longer while Mommy handled some quick paperwork upstairs. I made sure they were completely safe, warm, and distracted by their tablets. Then I walked over to my folding table and opened my work briefcase. I pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents I had meticulously prepared. I took out the original notarized property deed, listing my corporate entity as the sole owner of the estate. I grabbed the bank buyout records and the county tax assessments proving I had paid every single dime to keep the lights on for the last 2 years. And finally, I took out my copy of the completely fraudulent lease agreement Andre had forced me to sign just 24 hours ago. I placed all the documents carefully into a sleek black leather folder and walked toward the stairs. I walked up the wooden steps with the exact same slow measured pace I had used the night before. I was wearing a clean pressed white blouse and dark slacks, looking entirely professional and completely unbothered. When I reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the main hallway, I found my father and Andre standing with their chests puffed out, flanked by 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies. Andre looked terrible. He had deep dark bags under his eyes, and his casual weekend clothes looked rumpled, as if he had spent the entire night sweating and pacing. But despite his exhausted appearance, he was wearing a massive, arrogant smirk. He honestly believed he had won. He thought the shiny badges in the room gave him ultimate, unquestionable authority over me. Andre immediately stepped forward and pointed an accusing finger directly at my face. He told the deputies that I was a hostile, unpredictable tenant. He claimed I was squatting in the basement, flatly refusing to pay rent and causing severe emotional distress to his wife and his family. To prove his point, he pulled out his copy of the fraudulent lease agreement and practically shoved it into the chest of the lead deputy. My father chimed in right on cue, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken patriarch to absolute perfection. He put his hand over his heart and told the officers that it deeply broke him to have to do this to his own flesh and blood, but his daughter was mentally unstable. He said I had ruined a crucial business dinner the night before with paranoid, jealous delusions, and they simply could not feel safe with me in the house anymore. They were laying the groundwork to have me forcibly removed, perhaps even committed to a psychiatric hold, all to protect their pathetic, collapsing criminal empire. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, looked at the signed lease in his hand, and then looked up at me. He had clearly dealt with messy domestic disputes before, and he looked entirely unamused by the wealthy family drama unfolding in front of him. He asked me if I was Cassidy and if I was aware that I was in direct violation of a signed rental agreement. He told me that while formal evictions usually take time through the court system, the homeowners were claiming I was an immediate threat to their physical safety and their business operations. Because of that, he said he had grounds to ask me to vacate the premises immediately to prevent a domestic disturbance. Andre crossed his arms over his chest, his smirk widening into a full-blown grin of absolute victory. He looked me up and down like I was dirt on his shoes. He told me I had 10 minutes to pack my trash bags and get off his property before he asked the officers to press criminal trespassing charges. He was standing there basking in his own manufactured glory, desperately waiting for me to break down and cry. He was waiting for the ultimate humiliation of watching me beg for mercy in front of the police. I did not give Andre the satisfaction of a reaction. I stood perfectly still, letting his arrogant threat hang in the air. Before I could even address the lead deputy, the sharp click of high heels echoed from the master bedroom down the hall. Natalie emerged looking like she had spent the last 2 hours sitting in a professional makeup chair. She was wearing a perfectly draped silk robe over designer loungewear. But what truly made my stomach turn was the fact that she was holding her smartphone out in front of her face, attached to a portable ring light. She was actively broadcasting this nightmare to her hundreds of thousands of followers. Natalie walked slowly down the hallway, keeping the camera angled perfectly to capture her manufactured tears and the flashing police lights illuminating the foyer through the massive windows. She was speaking into the microphone with a trembling, breathless voice. playing the role of the ultimate heartbroken victim to absolute perfection. "Good morning, guys," Natalie whispered into her phone, pausing to wipe a fake tear away from her mascara. "I really need your prayers and positive energy today. We are going through an incredibly dark and traumatic family crisis right now. As you know, Andre and I have been working so hard to build our business and create a safe, luxurious environment for our son Jordan. But last night, my older sister's toxic jealousy finally reached a boiling point. She paused, flipping the camera lens for just a second to show her followers the two armed sheriff's deputies standing at the top of my staircase. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, clearly not thrilled to be featured on a live broadcast, but Natalie quickly flipped the camera back to her own face before they could object. "It completely shatters my heart," Natalie continued, pressing her manicured hand against her chest. "I tried so hard to help her. We gave her a place to stay after her divorce. We tried to integrate her into our success. But some people just want to drag you down to their level. She has been freeloading in our home, refusing to pay rent, and last night she tried to actively sabotage Andres' business out of pure, bitter spite. We had no choice but to involve the authorities. Having to kick out my toxic freeloading sister is the hardest thing I have ever done, but I have to protect my peace. I have to protect my family from her negative energy." I watched her perform, feeling a deep, chilling sense of awe at the sheer magnitude of her narcissism. She was monetizing my supposed eviction. She was using my children being thrown out of their home as content to boost her engagement metrics. She was standing in a house that I legally owned, spinning a completely fabricated narrative of victimhood to solicit sympathy and sponsorship deals from strangers on the internet. Andre stepped back, giving Natalie the spotlight. He looked incredibly proud of her. He actually believed that her live stream was cementing their narrative. If thousands of people watched the police escort me off the property, then it had to be true. It was the ultimate smear campaign designed to humiliate me so thoroughly that I would never dare to show my face in this family or this neighborhood ever again. The lead deputy cleared his throat loudly, breaking the theatrical spell my sister was trying to cast over the hallway. He held up a hand, gesturing for Natalie to lower her device. "Mom, I need you to step back and put the phone down," the deputy said, his voice firm and professional. "This is a civil matter, and we do not need this being broadcast while we are trying to resolve a domestic dispute." Natalie immediately stopped talking, though she kept the phone at chest height, her finger hovering over the record button. She nodded meekly, playing the compliant, frightened homeowner. "Of course, officer," she whispered. "Thank you so much for keeping us safe." The deputy turned his attention back to me. His expression was completely neutral, devoid of the malice my family was radiating, but his stance was strictly business. To him, I was just another deadbeat tenant in a wealthy suburb who had overstayed her welcome. He dealt with messy family evictions and bitter divorces every single day. He just wanted to clear the scene without anyone throwing a punch. "Listen, Cassidy," the deputy said, lowering his voice slightly in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. "I have reviewed the lease agreement provided by Mr. Andre. It clearly outlines your financial obligations for the lower-level unit, which he states have not been met. Furthermore, the property owners are stating that your presence here is creating a hostile and unsafe environment for their business operations and their minor child." He unhooked his thumbs from his belt and crossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "Now, technically, a formal eviction requires a court order," the deputy continued. "But because you are residing in a shared domestic space, and the primary leaseholders are alleging immediate emotional distress and business interference, we are asking you to vacate the premises voluntarily this morning. If you refuse and you continue to cause a disturbance, they have the right to press trespassing charges, and we will have no choice but to place you under arrest for disturbing the peace. I do not want to do that, especially since there are children involved." My father stepped out from behind the deputies wearing a mask of deep paternal disappointment. He shook his head slowly, looking at me as if I were a lost cause he had finally given up on saving. "Just do what the officer says, Cassidy," my father said, his voice dripping with fake sorrow for the benefit of the police. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. Do not traumatize Leo and Mia any further by making them watch you get put in handcuffs. Just go downstairs, pack whatever fits in your car, and leave peacefully. We will mail you the rest of your things. They had set the stage perfectly. They had the police. They had the live audience on Natalie's phone. They had the forged paperwork. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to drop my head in shame, turn around and walk down those wooden stairs to pack my children into the freezing morning air. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me carry those black contractor bags out the front door, under the watchful eyes of armed law enforcement. The heavy silence in the hallway stretched for several seconds. The deputies watched me closely, waiting for my compliance. Andre was practically vibrating with arrogant glee, his arms crossed over his chest. Natalie had stealthily raised her phone again, eager to catch my walk of shame for her followers. I looked at the lead deputy. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with my father. I maintained perfect, unwavering eye contact with the officer. I felt the smooth, cool leather of the black folder resting in my hands. It was the exact moment the dominoes reached the end of the line. "Officer," I said, my voice incredibly calm, echoing clearly in the quiet hallway. "I completely understand your position. You were called to a property based on a complaint filed by a property manager regarding a delinquent tenant. You are just doing your job based on the paperwork you were handed." The deputy nodded slowly, looking slightly relieved that I was being articulate and rational. "Yes, Mom," he replied. "That is correct. So if you could just head downstairs and begin packing." I did not move a single muscle toward the stairs. Instead, I tightened my grip on the leather folder. "The problem, officer," I continued, my tone shifting from polite compliance to absolute chilling authority, "is that the paperwork you were handed is a federal felony, and the people standing behind you are not the property owners." The smug grin on Andre's face instantly vanished. Natalie's phone wavered in her hand. My father froze, his fake expression of sorrow evaporating into genuine sudden confusion. I unzipped the leather folder, the sound slicing through the suffocating tension in the hallway. I pulled out the thick stack of notarized official documents. It was time to burn their fake empire straight to the ground. I pulled out the thick stack of notarized official documents from the black leather folder. On the very top was the original property deed. It was printed on heavy legal paper stamped with the undeniable raised seal of the county clerk. I handed the entire stack directly to the lead deputy without a hint of hesitation. "Officer, there is a massive misunderstanding happening here," I said, my voice perfectly steady and echoing clearly in the quiet hallway. "My brother-in-law and my father are not the property owners. I am the sole legal owner of this estate, and those two men are my non-paying tenants." The deputy took the papers, his brow furrowing in confusion. He looked at the deed, reading the name of the limited liability company. Then he looked at the bank buyout records and the state registration forms attached right behind it. Those documents clearly and irrefutably listed my full legal name as the sole proprietor and managing director of the company. My father let out a loud, forced laugh. It was a hollow, terrified sound that fell awkwardly flat in the high-ceilinged foyer. "Officer, do not listen to her," William said, taking a frantic step forward. "She is an accountant. She probably printed those off the internet just to cause trouble. I have owned this house for 20 years. This is completely ridiculous." The deputy held up a hand, stopping my father instantly. "Law enforcement officers deal with paperwork all day long. They know what a forged document looks like, and they know what a legitimate county seal looks like." The deputy flipped to the second page, then the third, carefully examining the property tax receipts. Every single receipt for the last 24 months, totaling tens of thousands of dollars, had been paid in full directly from my corporate account. I turned my attention to my sister. Natalie was still holding her phone up, the bright ring light reflecting off the polished marble floors. She was live streaming this entire interaction to her massive following. Her viewers were watching the exact moment the wealthy lifestyle she constantly bragged about was exposed as an absolute fraud. I looked directly into her camera lens. "William and Susan have not owned this house for 2 entire years," I said, making sure every single syllable was picked up by her microphone. "They secretly bankrupted themselves 3 years ago trying to fund your failed organic skincare line, Natalie. The bank foreclosed on them. They were weeks away from being thrown out onto the street. I bought the debt anonymously to save them. I paid off their liens. I let them stay here for free to save their pride, and I paid every single bill while they treated me like garbage." The color completely drained from Natalie's face. Her phone shook so violently in her hand that the ring light wobbled. She turned her head slowly and looked at our father, her eyes wide with panic. She was waiting for him to furiously deny it. She was waiting for him to yell at me for lying. But William could not even look at her. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. The silence from him was the loudest confession possible. The illusion was dead, and thousands of strangers on the internet had just watched it die. The lead deputy let out a long, heavy breath. He looked back at the fraudulent lease Andre had handed him earlier, the one Andre had tried to use to throw me out. The deputy held it up next to my legitimate property deed. His entire demeanor shifted in an instant. He went from looking at me like a nuisance to looking at Andre like a criminal suspect. "So let me get this straight," the deputy said, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative tone. "You called the police. You had us drive out here with our lights on to execute an emergency eviction. And you used a lease agreement that you drafted yourself for a property you do not even own." Andre started stammering immediately. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the panicked, wide-eyed look of a cornered animal. He threw his hands up defensively, taking a quick step back from the officers. "Wait, officer, you have to understand, I did not know," Andre pleaded, his smooth voice cracking under the pressure. "William told me he owned the house. He told me he was signing the management rights over to me. I thought I had the legal authority to draft that document. I did not let him wriggle out of it." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "Ignorance of the property deed does not excuse the fact that you used a fake corporate letterhead." "Andre," I said sharply, "you demanded $3,000 a month in back rent to be paid across state lines into your wife's personal checking account. You tried to weaponize the police to enforce a fake contract to extort money from the actual homeowner." The second deputy, who had been quiet until now, rested his hand on his utility belt. He looked at Andre with a mixture of disbelief and professional anger. "Sir," the second deputy said, "you just handed law enforcement a fraudulent document and attempted to use us to illegally remove the rightful homeowner from her own property. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in right now?" Natalie finally dropped her phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud crack, the screen shattering instantly, cutting off the live feed to her followers. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled sob as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. Her husband had just confessed to a crime in front of 2 sheriff's deputies, and her parents were broke. My father looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Cassidy, please," William whispered, his voice trembling. "Please do not do this. We are family. We can figure this out without involving the authorities any further. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding." I looked at the man who had threatened to call Child Protective Services on me just 24 hours ago. I looked at the man who had laughed while my children cried over their trash bags. The time for family favors was completely over. "It is a misunderstanding," I agreed, my voice ice cold. "You misunderstood who held the power in this house." I turned back to the lead deputy. "Officer, as the legal owner of this property, I am officially informing you that these people are non-paying tenants who have just attempted to commit fraud, and I am not the one who needs to pack my bags." The lead deputy let out a low whistle, shaking his head. He carefully folded the fraudulent lease Andre had provided and slid it into his uniform breast pocket. He did not hand it back. That simple, deliberate action sent a jolt of pure terror straight through Andre's chest. Mr. Andre, the deputy, said, his voice hard and entirely devoid of the professional courtesy he had been using just moments before. "I am confiscating this document. Attempting to use law enforcement to execute a fraudulent eviction based on forged legal documents is a severe offense. You are incredibly lucky I am treating this as a civil dispute for the next 5 minutes, because my partner and I are one bad attitude away from placing you in handcuffs for filing a false police report. Andre shrank back as if he had been physically struck. The towering, aggressive man who had cornered me in the kitchen and kicked my son's toys was completely gone. In his place was a trembling, pathetic coward who suddenly realized his expensive suit could not protect him from the consequences of his own arrogance. My mother, Susan, who had been lingering in the archway of the formal dining room, waiting to watch my humiliating exit, finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her fragile, ego-driven brain to process. She could not accept a reality where her golden son-in-law was a criminal and her scapegoat daughter was her landlord. She marched into the foyer, her face flushed and angry, mottled red. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and began to scream. She told the deputies not to listen to a single word I was saying. She frantically claimed that I was a manipulative, jealous thief who must have somehow hacked into the county records to forge a fake deed. She demanded that the officers arrest me immediately, clinging desperately to the delusion that she was still the wealthy matriarch of this household. I turned to look at her, my expression completely blank. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply let her scream until she ran out of breath, and then I delivered the cold, suffocating truth. "Mom," I said smoothly 3 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon, you sat at the kitchen island and cried until your mascara ran down your face. You had just signed the final foreclosure notices. You and Dad had drained every single retirement account and taken out massive equity lines of credit to pay off Natalie's credit cards and fund her ridiculous skincare company. The bank gave you 30 days to vacate. You spent an entire week packing boxes, terrified that your country club friends would find out you were completely broke. My mother froze. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. I took a slow step toward her, holding her gaze, forcing her to confront the absolute reality of her situation. And then miraculously I continued, my voice echoing in the silent foyer. An anonymous limited liability company stepped in and bought the debt. The bank told you the new owner was allowing you to stay on the property indefinitely rent-free as long as you maintained the grounds. Did you honestly believe that was a clerical error? Did you really think a faceless corporation just decided to let you live in a multi-million-dollar estate out of the goodness of their hearts? I watched the exact moment her brain finally connected the dots. I watched the horrible, crushing realization wash over her features. The pristine ivory tower she had been living in for the past 2 years was built entirely on my silent generosity. I had paid the property taxes. I had paid the homeowner's insurance. I had funded the illusion of her perfect life, and she had repaid me by telling me I was a worthless burden and throwing my children's beds into the trash. The physical toll of this realization was immediate. My mother's knees actually buckled. She had to reach out and grab the heavy wooden banister of the staircase just to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She looked at me not with the usual contempt or superiority, but with raw, unadulterated fear. With my parents completely neutralized, the toxic alliance that had held this family together instantly imploded. When narcissists realize the ship is sinking, they do not help each other to the lifeboats. They drown each other to stay afloat. Andre spun around and pointed his finger squarely at my father's chest. His voice was shrill and frantic. "You lied to me!" Andre screamed, his face contorted in panic. "You told me you owned this place. You told me I could use it as collateral for Zenith Apex Holdings. You set me up to take the fall for this. I never would have drafted that lease if I knew you were completely broke." My father did not take the accusation quietly. The illusion of the sophisticated gentleman vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered old man. He stepped toward Andre, his fists clenched at his sides. "You arrogant parasite!" my father yelled back, his voice cracking with rage. "You came into my house promising us millions. You told me your crypto firm was going to make us richer than ever. You manipulated my daughter, you leached off our social connections, and you have not produced a single dime of actual profit. You are nothing but a smooth-talking con artist. Natalie, who was still kneeling on the floor next to her shattered phone, covered her ears and began sobbing loudly. The perfect aesthetic family she had built her entire social media brand around was tearing each other to pieces right in front of the police. The lead deputy let out a loud, commanding shout, instantly silencing the screaming match. He stepped between Andre and my father, placing a hand firmly on his duty belt to assert control over the chaotic room. That is enough. The deputy barked his voice, leaving absolutely no room for argument. He looked at the three of them with pure disgust. I do not care who lied to who. I do not care about your family drama or your business deals. The only thing I care about right now is the law, and the law says that this woman is the sole property owner. The deputy turned to me, his expression softening into a look of professional respect. He recognized that I was the only rational, sane person in the entire building. Ma'am, the deputy said calmly. As the legal owner of this property, you have the right to dictate who is allowed to remain on the premises. Since there is no valid lease agreement for these individuals, and they have actively attempted to commit fraud against you, they are technically trespassing. Do you want them physically removed from the property today? The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently, it practically created a shockwave. My parents and Andre stopped breathing. They stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. They were entirely at my mercy. One single word from me and the deputies would physically drag them out the front door, forcing them to stand on the sidewalk in front of the entire wealthy neighborhood with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They waited for the axe to fall. They waited for me to scream to kick them out, to finally take the loud, explosive revenge they knew they entirely deserved. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in loud, messy, emotional outbursts. I deal in cold, calculated destruction. Throwing them out on the street was not nearly enough. I needed to make sure Andre could never hurt another family or defraud another investor ever again. I looked at Andre, letting a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I shook my head gently. No, officer, I said quietly, my eyes locked on my brother-in-law. I do not want you to remove them just yet. Because the fraudulent lease Andre handed you is actually the smallest crime he committed this week. And before they leave my house, I want to explain exactly what I did with the rest of his paperwork. Andre stopped breathing entirely. The true nightmare was finally ready to begin. I turned my full attention away from my parents and focused entirely on my brother-in-law. Andre looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, just waiting for the heavy wooden lever to be pulled. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked cheap and ill-fitting as his posture completely collapsed. The arrogant, smooth-talking financial visionary was gone. He was sweating so profusely that his crisp collar was completely soaked, and his eyes darted frantically around the foyer, looking for an exit that did not exist. You thought you were so clever, Andre, I said, keeping my voice incredibly even and completely devoid of sympathy. You thought you could banish me to the basement to suffer in silence while you took over my house and played pretend with my parents. But you made a fatal miscalculation. You forgot what I do for a living. You put a forensic accountant into a quiet, isolated room with a secure internet connection and absolutely nothing to do but look at the paperwork you forced her to sign. I took a slow step toward him. He instinctively took a step back, his polished shoes squeaking against the marble floor. The two sheriff's deputies watched the exchange with intense, silent fascination. They had come here for a routine domestic eviction, but they quickly realized they had walked right into the middle of a massive financial execution. Before you slid that lease agreement across the kitchen island, I explained, my words cutting through the heavy silence of the room. I had no legal right or reason to look into your private business affairs. But the moment you handed me a legally binding contract demanding money, you invited me into your books. You gave me the exact name of your limited liability company. You gave me the state where it was registered. You gave me the corporate address. And most importantly, you gave me the direct bank routing numbers for the accounts you were using to collect your fraudulent revenue. Andre opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, desperate rasp came out. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He knew exactly what I was going to say next. He knew that his entire house of cards was built on a foundation of terrible lies, and he knew that an expert had just spent 2 weeks systematically tearing it apart. I spent the last 14 nights down in that cold concrete basement doing a deep dive forensic audit into Zenith Apex Holdings. I continued making sure the deputies heard every single word clearly. I logged into the federal databases. I pulled your corporate filings from the state of Nevada. Do you want to know what I found, Andre? I found a registered agent operating out of a strip mall mailbox service. I found 0 registered employees, 0 physical assets, and absolutely 0 legitimate investment licenses associated with your name. My father let out a soft, horrified gasp from the corner of the room. He had mortgaged his entire remaining social reputation on this man, promising his wealthy country club friends that Andre was the real deal. Now he was being forced to listen as the truth was brutally laid out in front of law enforcement. But that was just the beginning, I said, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact with my brother-in-law. The real magic happened when I started tracing the money. You see, arrogant criminals always make the exact same mistakes. They think that if they move money around enough times, it simply becomes invisible. But money leaves a digital fingerprint, Andre. Every single wire transfer, every single deposit, and every single withdrawal creates a permanent ledger. And your ledger is a complete disaster. I watched the last remaining shreds of color drain from Andre's face. He raised his trembling hands as if he could physically stop the words from coming out of my mouth. I tracked the $500,000 you secured from those local investors last year. I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. You told them you were buying commercial real estate in emerging markets, but you did not buy a single piece of property. Instead, you transferred those funds into 3 different shell companies. You used the newly invested capital to pay off your earliest investors, creating the illusion of a massive guaranteed return. You bought their silence and their glowing recommendations with stolen money. The lead deputy shifted his weight, his hand resting near his radio. Ma'am, the deputy asked, his voice low and serious. Are you stating that this man is operating a Ponzi scheme? I turned my head slightly to look at the officer, but I kept my body angled toward Andre. Yes, officer, I replied firmly. I am stating exactly that. He is running a textbook Ponzi scheme, using this residential property as a fake corporate headquarters to legitimize his operation. But the absolute worst part is not just how he stole the money. It is where he put the rest of it. I shifted my gaze over to my sister. Natalie was still sitting on the floor amidst the shattered glass of her smartphone. Her perfect hair was a mess, and her mascara was running down her face in thick black lines. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter confusion. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding hard work and relying on her looks, happily turning a blind eye to where her lavish lifestyle was actually coming from. After you paid off the early investors to keep the scam alive, I said, looking directly at my sister, you had to hide the remaining capital. So you funneled the stolen money through a secondary holding account and then washed it directly into a domestic lifestyle consulting firm, a firm that is registered under the name Natalie Zenith. Natalie let out a sharp, panicked cry. She shook her head violently, pressing her back against the wall. No, Natalie sobbed, her voice high and hysterical. No, I do not know anything about that. I just do brand partnerships. I just post pictures of my house. I do not run a financial consulting firm. She might not have known the legal mechanics of what her husband was doing, but ignorance is not a defense when you are actively spending the proceeds of federal wire fraud. I looked back at Andre, who was now staring at the floor, completely defeated. You used your wife's checking account to siphon over $1 million of stolen investor funds over the last 18 months. I said, driving the final nail into his coffin. You bought her designer clothes, You leased luxury sports cars, and you catered lavish dinner parties right here in my dining room, using money you stole from hard-working people. You built her entire fake internet persona using funds that belonged to other people. And you left a paper trail so wide and so painfully obvious that a first-year accounting student could have successfully audited you. Andre finally snapped. The sheer weight of the exposure broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. He lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of pure, desperate rage. "You shut your mouth!" Andre screamed, throwing his arms out toward me. "You are lying. You manipulated the records because you have always been jealous of us. You are a bitter, lonely woman who could not keep her own husband, so you are trying to destroy mine." He did not even make it 2 steps. The second deputy moved with lightning speed, stepping directly into Andre's path and shoving a heavy hand hard into the center of his chest. Andre stumbled backward, gasping for air as the deputy completely stopped his momentum. "Take one more step toward her," the deputy warned, his voice dropping into a dangerous, commanding growl, "and you will be leaving this house in handcuffs right now. Do you understand me?" Andre raised his hands in surrender, stepping back and leaning heavily against the wall. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under his sweat-stained shirt. He looked like a trapped animal who finally realized the cage was securely locked. I did not flinch when he lunged at me. I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel. I wanted him to understand that his loud, aggressive intimidation tactics meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. He had brought this entirely upon himself. He had chosen to target me, assuming I was weak because I was quiet. He was finally learning the hard way that the quiet ones are the ones who carefully hold the shovel while you dig your own grave. I watched Andre press his spine against the wall, his breathing ragged and shallow. The second deputy did not step away from him. The physical barrier of law enforcement was now firmly established, and the atmosphere in my foyer had completely transformed. This was no longer a wealthy suburban family squabble over basement rent. This was the scene of a major financial crime. I looked at the piece of folded paper resting inside the lead deputy's breast pocket. "That lease you made me sign yesterday morning, Andre," I said, making sure my voice carried the absolute weight of his destruction. "You thought you were asserting dominance. You thought you were putting me in my place. But what you actually did was hand me the smoking gun. You used a fake limited liability company to extort money on a property you do not own. You documented your intent to commit wire fraud and tax evasion, and you signed it with your favorite gold-plated pen." Andre swallowed hard, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He opened his mouth, perhaps to formulate another lie or to beg for a deal, but I cut him off instantly. "I did not just keep that lease for my own records." I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, clinical register. "I scanned it. I attached it to the massive encrypted audit file I compiled over the last 2 weeks. And yesterday afternoon, while you were busy ordering expensive floral arrangements and practicing your fake pitch for the dinner party, I forwarded your entire prospectus, your banking routing numbers, and that fraudulent lease directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Chicago field office of the FBI." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right after a fatal car crash. "You are not a visionary investor, Andre," I stated clearly, driving the final stake through his manufactured ego. "You are running a sloppy, desperate Ponzi scheme, using my house as fake collateral, and you are going to federal prison." The lead deputy slowly took his hand off his duty belt. His expression was completely grim. He looked at me, assessing the validity of my claims. He knew that an accountant throwing around acronyms like the SEC and the FBI was not making an empty threat. He turned his attention back to Andre, who was now sliding slowly down the wall until he was practically sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands. "Ma'am," the lead deputy said, his voice dropping into a serious, formal register. "You have submitted these documents to federal authorities. Do you have a case number or a direct contact at the field office?" I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a crisp white business card. I handed it to the deputy. It was the direct line to a senior investigator at the Financial Crimes Division, whom I had worked with on previous corporate embezzlement cases. I told the deputy that the investigator was already reviewing the file and that federal warrants for bank account freezes were likely being drafted as we spoke. The deputy looked at the business card, nodded slowly, and handed it to his partner. The second deputy immediately stepped closer to Andre, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. They were not arresting him for the federal crimes, yet that would require a federal warrant, but they were absolutely taking him into custody for the fraudulent documents he had just presented to local law enforcement. Mr. Andre, the lead deputy, barked, his voice echoing sharply. Stand up, turn around, and place your hands behind your back. You are being detained on suspicion of filing a false police report and presenting forged legal documents to a sworn officer. Andre did not fight back. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He slowly got to his feet, his knees trembling so violently he could barely stand. He turned around, placing his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting closed around his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute justice. Natalie let out a piercing, hysterical scream as she watched her husband get cuffed. She scrambled up from the floor, her silk robe dragging across the shattered glass of her phone. "You cannot take him!" she sobbed, grabbing blindly at the deputy's arm. "He did not do anything wrong. She is lying. Please, Andre, tell them she is lying." Andre did not look at her. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his head hanging low in ultimate defeat. He knew it was over. The luxury cars, the expensive dinners, the country club memberships, all of it was gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of federal indictments and decades in a penitentiary. The deputies guided Andre toward the front door, leaving Natalie weeping uncontrollably in the center of the foyer. The massive, sophisticated illusion my family had dedicated their entire lives to protecting was now a pile of burning rubble. But I was not finished. The criminal element had been neutralized, but the personal betrayal had yet to be fully addressed. I turned my back on the front door and focused my attention entirely on the three remaining people in the room. My mother, my father, and my sister were standing in a loose circle, looking absolutely shattered. They were stripped of their arrogance, their fake wealth, and their toxic authority. They looked like strangers. They looked pathetic. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for them. I felt the cold, hard memory of my 8-year-old son, crying on the stairs, surrounded by black trash bags. I took a step toward them, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. My father flinched instinctively, taking a step back. I looked directly at him, then shifted my gaze to my mother, and finally settled on my sobbing sister. 2 days ago, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely unyielding, you walked into my children's bedrooms. You handed them garbage bags. You forced them to pack up their favorite toys, their school books, and their blankets, and you told them they were being evicted so a con artist could have a home office. You laughed in my face when I told you that you were making a mistake. You told me to know my place. You told me I was living on your charity. My mother started to cry. It was not the fake manipulative crying she used to get her way. It was the ugly, desperate sobbing of a woman who suddenly realized she had destroyed her own life. "Cassidy, please," she whimpered, reaching her shaking hands out toward me. "Please, we did not know. We honestly thought Andre was successful. We were just trying to do what was best for the family. We are your parents. You cannot do this to us." I slapped her hands away, not violently, but with a firm, disgusted rejection that made her gasp. "Do not ever use that word with me again." I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. Family does not throw children into an unheated basement. Family does not threaten to call Child Protective Services with fabricated abuse claims just to extort money. You threw my children out like trash for a man who is about to go to federal prison. You traded your own grandchildren for the illusion of a country club membership. My father dropped to his knees. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had tried to physically intimidate me in the kitchen yesterday was now kneeling on the marble floor, openly weeping. He begged me to forgive them. He pleaded with me, swearing that they would change, that they would treat me with the respect I deserved. He told me they had nowhere else to go, that the bank accounts were completely empty, and that their credit was entirely destroyed. He played the ultimate victim card, begging for the mercy he had explicitly denied me. Natalie chimed in, her voice completely hysterical. "Where am I supposed to go, Cassidy?" she shrieked, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "Andre is going to jail. My bank accounts are going to be frozen. I have a son. You cannot throw a 7-year-old boy out on the street. You are a monster if you do this." I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but contempt for her weaponized incompetence. "Your son is your responsibility, Natalie," I replied coldly. "And unlike you, I am not a monster. Jordan can stay here with me while you figure out your living situation. I will make sure he is fed safe and warm, but you, Mom and Dad, are leaving today, right now." The absolute finality of my words hung in the air. The deputies, having secured Andre in the back of their cruiser, stepped back into the foyer to monitor the eviction. They stood by the door, their presence a silent, undeniable enforcement of my authority. "You have exactly 1 hour to get your things out of my house," I commanded, pointing my finger toward the grand staircase. "You can take your clothes, your personal toiletries, and whatever fits in the trunks of your leased cars. If you are not off my property in 60 minutes, I will ask these officers to formally press criminal trespassing charges, and you will join Andre in a holding cell." My mother let out a wailing cry, dropping to her knees next to my father. She grabbed the hem of my designer slacks, her tears soaking into the fabric. "Please, Cassidy," she begged, her voice entirely broken. "We are family. We are your blood. You cannot just erase us like a bad calculation. We gave you life." I looked down at the woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the woman who had prioritized aesthetic over unconditional love. I gently but firmly pulled my leg back, stepping out of her grasp. I looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the final devastating blow, using the exact same insult they had used to justify my mistreatment. "I am just a number cruncher, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "And the numbers say you are a massive liability." I turned my back on them. I did not wait to watch them pack. I did not supervise their frantic, humiliating scramble to stuff their designer clothes into suitcases. I simply walked away, leaving them to face the absolute devastation of the reality they had built for themselves. It has been exactly 6 months since that chaotic morning in the foyer. The harsh Chicago winter has faded, giving way to a bright and incredibly peaceful spring. The sprawling suburban estate, once a hollow monument to my family's vanity and deception, finally feels like a real home. The oppressive, suffocating tension that used to cling to these walls has been completely scrubbed clean. There are no more fake dinner parties to endure, no more whispered insults in the hallways, and no more tiptoeing around the fragile egos of deeply insecure people. There is only peace, quiet, and a whole lot of justice. Andre is currently sitting in a federal holding facility without bail, awaiting trial. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not just freeze his accounts, they completely dismantled his entire existence. When the FBI raided his rented strip mall mailbox and seized his encrypted hard drives, they found exactly what I told them they would find. His grand crypto investment firm was nothing but a poorly constructed shell designed to bleed hard-working people dry. He is facing multiple federal counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery. The wealthy men he tried to impress that night in my dining room, including Richard, all cooperated fully with the federal prosecutors, eager to distance themselves from his radioactive reputation. Andre's expensive tailored suits have been replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit, and his flashy leased sports cars were repossessed weeks ago. He is looking at decades in a federal penitentiary, all because he got greedy and tried to extort $3,000 a month from a forensic accountant who had access to a secure internet connection. The fallout for the rest of my family was just as swift and absolutely merciless. Natalie's livestream, the one she arrogantly intended to use as a weapon to humiliate me, became her absolute undoing. The internet is entirely undefeated when it comes to preserving disasters. Her broadcast went viral, but not in the way she manifested. Millions of people watched her husband get arrested and heard the undeniable documented truth about their fake wealth. Every single one of her brand sponsors dropped her within 48 hours, releasing public statements distancing themselves from the fraud investigation. The aesthetic lifestyle empire she built on stolen money evaporated overnight. Today, she is living with William and Susan in a cramped, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. My parents went from pretending to own a $2.5 million estate to arguing over who gets to use the single shared bathroom in the morning. My father tried to show his face at his beloved country club shortly after the eviction, only to be politely but firmly asked to leave because his membership dues were drastically in arrears, and his reputation was entirely ruined. The toxic enabling dynamic they used to weaponize against me is now turning them against each other in that tiny space. They have no money, no social standing, and absolutely no power left to wield. I did keep my promise regarding my nephew Jordan. I paid for his pediatric therapy and ensured his school tuition was covered through an anonymous trust, shielding him from the terrible sins of his parents as best as I could. But my boundaries with the adults remain absolute and impenetrable. I have not spoken a single word to my parents or my sister since the day they packed the trunks of their cars and drove down my driveway for the very last time. I blocked their numbers across all devices and routed all necessary legal communications strictly through my attorney. I cut the dead weight out of my life, and I have never felt lighter. I walked upstairs this morning carrying a basket of warm laundry. The sun was streaming through the massive arched windows, casting a golden glow over the hardwood floors. As I walked down the long hallway, I heard a sound that made my chest swell with immense, overwhelming pride. It was the sound of Leo and Mia laughing hysterically. I stepped into the doorway of Mia's freshly painted bedroom. The sterile beige influencer aesthetic was completely gone, ripped out and replaced with warmth and color. The walls were a vibrant, cheerful purple, absolutely covered in her finger paintings and drawings. Leo was sitting on her plush rug, helping her build a massive castle out of the very same plastic blocks Andre had cruelly kicked across the floor 6 months ago. There were no black contractor trash bags in sight. There was no fear in their eyes. They were safe. They were happy. And they were finally truly home. This house is legally mine on paper, but more importantly, it is emotionally mine. I protected my children. I secured our financial future, and I broke a generational cycle of toxicity simply by refusing to play their loud, manipulative games. I did not have to scream to be heard. I did not have to tear anyone else down to build myself up. I simply let them act on their own arrogance while I quietly gathered the receipts. True power does not need to announce itself at a catered dinner party. True power is having the undeniable evidence, maintaining your composure under fire, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting for you. They thought because I was quiet I was weak, but the loudest people in the room usually have the most to hide. Have you ever let someone dig their own grave while you quietly held the shovel? Let me know in the comments.